Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our fireside chat. So my name is Jiamin, and I'm the lead at Parcel Monitor, the leading platform for e-commerce logistics insights. With our studies and together with industry experts around the world, we hope to provide our community members a platform to acquire knowledge and exchange insights about retail, e-commerce, and logistics. So we all know that shipping costs are rising at a faster pace than they have in a decade, which has impacted and will continue to impact retailers, carriers, and e-commerce businesses. So with that in mind, we're extremely excited to have with us our e-commerce delivery expert, Nate, to share his insights on how carriers and retailers should respond to these price hikes. Nate comes with almost 20 years of experience in building parcel programs and well-known brands such as Gap and Abercrombie and Fitch. To moderate this discussion, we have with us Vishnu, an experienced logistics journalist that has written in major logistics publications such as FreightWaves and Business Insider. And of course, to our audience, if you have any questions during this discussion, please feel free to leave a comment on the event page itself. So very, very nice to have you, Nate, Vishnu.
Thank you,
So
Jim.
Thank you. So without further ado, let's get the session started. So
good morning,
over to you,
everyone.
Vishnu.
Yes. Good morning, everyone, and good evening, depending on where you're tuning in for the session today. I'm Vishnu, and I'd be your host for today. Nate and I would be discussing how shippers, retailers, and couriers look at the parcel shipping market and the different ways by which they can keep their operations resilient in a shipping environment that's getting pricier every year. So Nate, let's start with running over the general lay of the land. What's the situation like in the parcel delivery market today in the context of demand and capacity availability? And also, do you continue to see the impact from the pandemic on the market at large?
Yeah, with regards to capacity and demand, it really has, over the last 2 years, been a really difficult environment. I'll say both for shippers and carriers. We're at the point now, I think, where some of that capacity constraint has abated a little bit, but it still exists. And say looking at the U.S. market is a pretty good example to where that capacity is still constrained. In the holiday season of this past year in 2021, there were capacity constraints based on demand exceeding parcel networks, but it wasn't as severe as it was in 2020. And 2020 is really where, of course, the e-commerce growth and then the package growth was significant, which really caused a lot of operational challenges for both shippers and shippers and delivery providers throughout the year. But it really culminated in the holiday period in Q4 in 2020. And that's where there were significant operational challenges. Shippers weren't able to get their volume even off their dock every day, all the time, meaning carriers didn't have the capacity to move it through their network and get it delivered. And so that over time has lessened, I think, for two reasons. Namely, carriers have added capacity. Many of the national carriers, UPS and FedEx in the U.S., also the U.S. Postal Service, have made a concerted effort to add capacity strategically to help support that e-commerce growth and the volume. And the rate of growth has lessened in 2021 over 2020. And so it's allowed a little bit more time, I think, for carriers to get caught up, so to speak. Meanwhile, shippers are trying to navigate the environment of those carriers having constrained networks, while at the same time trying to manage the expense alongside a long list of other priorities. Sometimes they get pushed up above shipping. So it's been pretty volatile. I think as we're starting 2022, it's a little bit more solid than it has been, but still very difficult to navigate.
Got it. I guess you would agree that there hasn't been a more critical time than now for shippers to understand market conditions and to play accordingly. In that regard, what do you think is impacting the parcel segment's growth? And what can shippers do to future-proof their operations in this ever-evolving logistics landscape?
Well, with regards to the growth, again, the event really, it's been about 2 years ago when the volume really escalated from e-commerce growth. And by the time we got through 2020, in the US market, there was a 37% parcel volume growth over 2019, which is absolutely unheard of. There's hasn't been that type of growth really from a total market standpoint. And so now as we look forward through 2021 and even now, any growth on that much higher baseline, it's just challenging for carriers to keep up with that growth by adding capacity. And so what that's done really with shippers is, I think, two really important things. One is operational risk from a capacity standpoint, both actually having the carriers in place to be able to pick up the packages every day and move it through their network, but also even once that volume is in their network, is that the reliability, generally speaking, not in all cases, compared to pre-pandemic, is not as high. And so that really has a customer impact of being able to communicate those issues to customers and to be able to proactively plan which carriers you're tendering packages to, and being very thoughtful about that. So the operational impact is pretty high. The other one, which has been very public as well, is expense, and that one really is right now it's kind of driven, say, kind of top down in the market from some of the larger carriers. FedEx and UPS have been very open about raising rates. They've done it not just their annual rate increases, but they've added surcharges. And so that's very difficult for shippers to deal with. But it's not just those two carriers. Honestly, costs for all the carriers have increased. That's continuing with inflation and labor challenges right now. And so for shippers to be able to really navigate this landscape, one of the really key things is to be able to diversify your risk in the way of adding carriers to your carrier base that really fit specific needs. So not just relying on one carrier for all of your delivery needs, having multiple in place that really serve a specific purpose. And that gives you some operational flexibility as well to be able to shift volume between carriers, a little bit of expense flexibility too, not too much, depends on the situation, because everyone is, I say everyone, all of the carriers have raised rates. But if you're relying upon one carrier, then you literally just have no options. And I think that's what many retailers have realized over the past, say, 12 to 18 months.
Got it. It's interesting that you bring up the idea of career diversification for shippers and retailers, because that was, again, a part of my question. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, and also probably touch on the challenges shippers and retailers have with achieving this? Like, how do they work with multiple careers?
Yeah, it really depends on, I think, the situation of a particular shipper, the size of the company, the amount of volume they have, the complexity of their network. But some of the challenges they run into, which is pretty common, is from a technology standpoint. A key part of being able to use a diversified carrier base is having technology in place, in the form of a multi-carrier shipping solution that does several things. I mean, one is it has an integration point with multiple carriers. I mean, that's kind of table stakes, that should be there. But then the ability to manage the volume between carriers, allocate volume based on certain logic around cost or whatever parameter, kind of business rule that you want to use to govern which packages go to which carriers. That's, I think, one of the things that is really critical to managing or maybe enabling a diversified carrier base. Some of the others, I think, are being kind of knowing where to start or how to start that process. If it's a retailer who, for a very long time, has been relying upon one or maybe two carriers, going into that process and analyzing all the data to understand, which volume segments can or should they move based on other carriers' serviceability, pricing without actually going through a bid process, like understanding the market. I think that's one challenge for sure. The other one, which goes right along with that on the pricing, is contracts with the national carriers, FedEx and UPS. They're highly, let's say, restrictive at times with revenue and volume commitments, more so on the revenue side. And it's interesting because that's a very common, I think, constraint or issue that a retailer might share. Sometimes it's not quite as restrictive as it seems. And there's ways to move volume to other carriers. And if that revenue declines with, say, FedEx or UPS, at times it won't impact discounts with that carrier. Other times it will, but it does so in, I won't say a nominal way, but somewhat 1-2% of a discount. And the value you're gaining, however a shipper defines that, if it's operational flexibility, capacity, or reduced expense through those other carriers, that all has to be taken into account in a holistic view. So a big challenge, I think, is shippers focus on the constraints that they have, or at least the perceived ones, and some of them don't get past that to add carriers to their program.
Got it. Talking of working with multiple carriers, there's also this question of what will happen if there's a slide in the volumes that shippers can push. So what can be done to ensure operations run smoothly and relationships don't suffer in such a situation? So are there ways for shippers to prioritize certain carriers over the others especially during times when they can't push the same amount of volume as usual?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that shippers can do. And one I went through quite a bit on the multi-carrier shipping solution. So that's definitely one area that can enable very detailed, accurate management of that volume and how you allocate it to different carriers. So that's one thing that I think really is critical to have a multi-carrier shipping approach. So assuming that's in place, there still needs to be a certain amount of partnership and close communication with all of those, from a shipper standpoint, with all of those carriers that you have in place. And that's both day-to-day operations of forecasting the volume, adjustments to that. Retailers, I spent 17 years working for them. They're not the best all the time in detailed forecasts from a package volume standpoint, and it's difficult to do. And so just being transparent and communicating that information, both long term, which is more of a strategic relationship with the carrier of what to expect from a volume and revenue standpoint, and then getting down to the detail level on a day-to-day basis. It might not be incredibly accurate, but advising those carriers of variance to that, reasons why, if appropriate. I mean, if you have several carriers in place, then you've got multiple relationships to manage. So you can't always be 100% transparent. But I think doing that appropriately, then also, it builds a relationship. It's this process isn't just rates and picking up packages and delivering packages. Most any carrier can do that, but it really requires close collaboration between a shipper and carrier. That goes both ways, to be able to manage through that relationship as volume fluctuates. And what I'll say is, I think alternative carriers to the national carriers, FedEx and UPS. So those alternatives, and maybe out of necessity, I don't know, are usually more flexible with shippers on some of that variance. UPS and FedEx, like I mentioned before, they've got pretty strict, rigid contractual commitments. If those are met, then I think the collaboration, the transparency, everything's great. If they're not, that becomes a challenge, and that's where shippers could see an issue on the expense side.
Got it. So continuing that discussion, so what are your thoughts on shippers that are engaging with regional carriers more often than buying capacity from major players like UPS or FedEx? Do you see a future where such a practice would be more prevalent, like more and more shippers are approaching regional carriers?
Absolutely, and I think we've seen that probably out of necessity over the last 2 years. In 2020, just generally speaking, the entire year was volatile across the board. So out of necessity, from kind of a risk mitigation standpoint, I think some companies focused on adding carriers, but it was I would say very reactive. Throughout 2021, and I think going forward, there's an identification of the value from shippers of having a diversified carrier base, and in order to do that, you have to have alternative carriers in the form, sometime of regionals. So regional carriers that fit a specific need within a geographic footprint. There are other alternatives that kind of say like a last mile type carrier that only serves a very concentrated, say, metro area in multiple markets. And I think there's a trend, at least I hope, I try to advocate for this whenever I can, of retailers looking at not just rates and cost first. So don't look necessarily at the program to say, my rates are going up with UPS or FedEx, or insert the carrier name. I need to find a way to reduce expense. My experience is if you start there, sometimes you don't get away from the expense. And so the way that I try to advise is to define the objectives of your program first, be it service, capacity, speed to customer, expense, maybe even in that order, and determine the best carriers and services that meet collectively those objectives. And that's where I think there's more openness from a retailer standpoint, and realizing that they have to engage alternative carriers. We'll see. I mean, I think regional carriers have been in the market for several years, and so there's already, to an extent, a certain amount of credibility established. Certainly for the ones in the U.S. market, say LaserShip, OnTrack, and some others. But there are newer providers that have entered the market, newer types of providers that you can still say maybe regional, but they focus on middle mile or middle mile optimization, a Pandion or X Delivery or AirTerra. So that group, I think, there needs to be some openness on the retailer side to consider, different operating models, because like we started the discussion, there's a, we'll say a finite, but right now a capacity constraint. And I think retailers just need to be open to those new concepts, explore. If it's a fit, then test it and use it. If it's not, then at least
Sure. Um, talking about the other side of the spectrum, like deciding on how to be on the good books of careers for shippers. I mean, like shippers are currently fighting for capacity that has, remained tight for at least a couple of years now. So what do you think they can do to ensure they get guaranteed capacity in this constrained environment, especially because there's a lot of competition in the market today?
It is difficult, as far as guaranteed capacity. From a really large shipper standpoint, I mean, there's a way to do that in partnering closely with the large carriers, national carriers, and in a way, you can say it's buying capacity. They're paying a premium for that. However, I think going back to earlier, just talking about the communication and the transparency, I think that is where building that relationship, regardless of the carrier, I mean, national carriers, but also all the alternative ones, from a shipper standpoint, is being a partner and expecting the same from your carrier, and providing them with information around forecasting package volume, and a look into your business. Again, being appropriately transparent, but about what's on the way. And so, if there's a certain level of transparency there, then that will help to establish trust. Now, of course, as you have to move volume around within your own program, that can cause a little bit of friction with some relationships. But from my experience, most carriers, namely UPS and FedEx, don't have any issue with raising the rates. And so there needs to be a certain level of understanding and reciprocation when a shipper, with I assume good reason, is, say, moving volume to another carrier. But again, to me, it starts with communication, and back to just the initial, to close out the thought on capacity, is appropriately having the right number and multiple carriers in place helps to ensure that you have options on capacity. So the fewer carriers in place generally, unless you're a really small shipper and don't have any concerns with a UPS or FedEx only. Otherwise, you're going to need to have multiple carriers in place that you can draw on that capacity, when needed.
Got it. I wanted to touch upon the differences in the challenges that large shippers face versus SME shippers. How hard is it for SMEs to buy and arrange capacity today, especially in the spot market?
Yeah, smaller SMBs, there are technically less options and less flexibility because they have less volume, and it really depends on what their needs are. I mean, if they're very, very small, they're shipping a couple hundred packages a day, then to start, it is going to need to be a national carrier probably in place, and they won't have necessarily the volume or the options to have several carriers in place. So UPS actually is a good example that they've been focusing on the SMB segment. They have a digital access program that has been very successful for them, and I think provided value to SMBs. I think the revenue from the UPS standpoint in 2021 exceeded $1 billion. And so those types of programs, I think, are they're offered through some third parties. That's one option. The Postal Service, U.S. Postal Service, depending on the type of business that a retailer might be in, lightweight packages. The USPS has had some service challenges, but if it's a especially lightweight, or you may even kind of lower retail price type product line, that's a good option as well. I think some of the other challenges would be from a technology standpoint. they're not going to have access to multiple carriers to use, or maybe even a need to use a complex multi-carrier shipping solution. So there are other ones that are platforms that are made specifically kind of catered to that smaller segment. ShipStation is one. Easy Post kind of goes to the spectrum of smaller, but also to medium size and larger. And so I think there are options there, but from an SMB standpoint, the costs, cost per package in total of a program, it's going to be higher, generally speaking, than a larger shipper because they just don't have the volume to really drive better rates and options across several carriers.
Got it. True. So in this world of e-commerce, where e-commerce package volumes are surging every year, we also see this side of the picture where consumer trends are evolving and just going into thin air in relatively faster time frames. So in this situation, how hard is it for large shippers and also SMEs to predict consumer trends and to buy capacity based on those forecasts?
I think it is difficult. I think one of the ways to do that, and I don't know maybe necessarily about being able to really predict or forecast the consumer behavior as much, but one would be to influence it in a way that then you can align your carriers, your capacity behind it. And so what I mean by that is, if you're very, I think, general about the shipping options that you have in place, that's something from a customer-facing standpoint. So it's a standard shipping option is 5 to 7 days. There might be an expedited option. That's one where I think you're able to not really predict buying or consumer behavior, but the package volume is relatively stable and almost kind of vanilla. That might work from a capacity planning standpoint, but I think more on the consumer behavior perspective is being very focused on delivery, offering delivery options that engage customers so there's a personalized delivery date based on their location. That's something that initially, if it's implemented, is going to be challenging to really understand what that reaction might be. But over time, that will stabilize too. And then you start to really be more specific with how you're going to allocate that volume to different services, based on transit and cost. And that's one way to at least influence that behavior to an extent. I will say just there's a tremendous amount of complexity and challenges in aligning the capacity, especially for very large retailers, down to a carrier service level on a daily basis. So there's no kind of one solution that fits all, but if the more specific that I think you can be with your delivery options, the more predictable one over time that volume will be from a consumer standpoint.
Got it. I see that we are actually running out of time already, Nate, but I think just to wind our discussion up, do you have any closing words on the topic before we conclude?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say, we talked about carrier diversification as one way to help navigate some of the challenges around capacity and pricing. And that's something, in my opinion, that retailers at the very least should explore, but it requires being very intentional. It actually is almost a mindset change of, instead of trying to find a carrier or a service to fit into your current program at a really small level, it needs to be more of a kind of a step back, a macro review of your entire program, what your objectives are, and then determining how to source the cares and services, and make sure that the expense also maybe aligns with what your goals are, but don't focus on expense first. That's what I would leave you with.
Great. It was wonderful talking to you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for the insights, Nate. I hope the listeners had a great time tuning in. Do check the Parcel Monitor LinkedIn page for upcoming events. We have one more coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for listening in and have a great day.